He froze the moment the little girl said it. "I think you're my daddy."
Listen, we need to talk
The
about this
ballroom didn't
calmly.
breathe. The ruthless crime lord, Caleb Ward, turned ghost white,
Listen,
staring
we need to
across
talk
the
about
room
this
at the woman
calmly.
who'd vanished 7 years ago, and the child with his eyes. Cameras flash, whispers ignite, and in one heartbeat, the king of the underworld realizes his empire isn't his greatest secret anymore. She is. The Harborview Hotel ballroom stretched before her like a stage she no longer belonged on. Marble floors, crystal fixtures, and the kind of wealth that whispered rather than shouted. Julia had learned to recognize the difference between people who worked for their money and people who inherited the right to take it. This crowd was the latter. Ella tugged at her hand, eyes wide with wonder. "Mommy, it's like a castle." At 7 years old, her daughter saw magic where Julia saw danger. The girl deserved better than a mother haunted by a past she couldn't explain, who'd spent years looking over her shoulder in a town where nothing ever happened. Tonight was supposed to be about the recital, her students performing for the board, raising funds for the studio. Simple, professional, safe. "Stay close, sweetheart," Julia murmured, straightening Ella's dress. "After the performance, we'll get ice cream and go home." The music shifted, something classical, something that reminded her of stages she'd left behind. She'd been a different person then, a ballet prodigy in New York, performing in venues that made this ballroom look modest. But that was before the scandal, before she'd learned that loving the wrong man could destroy everything you'd built. She shook off the memory and guided Ella toward the side entrance where her students waited. They had 15 minutes before curtain. That's when she saw him. Caleb Ward stood near the bar, surrounded by men in tailored suits who moved like shadows given form. He was older than she remembered, harder, his features carved by years she hadn't witnessed. But those eyes, that posture, the way he commanded space without saying a word, she would have recognized him in any crowd, in any life. He shouldn't be here. Julia's breath caught. She turned away sharply, pulling Ella toward the backstage area, heart hammering against her ribs. 7 years. She'd built a life specifically designed to avoid nights like this, people like him, worlds where violence wore expensive cologne and called itself legitimate business. "Mommy, you're squeezing too tight," Ella protested. "Sorry, baby, Julia's voice failed as she realized Ella's hand had slipped free. The girl was already moving, drawn by something Julia couldn't see, weaving through the crowd with the confidence of a child who'd never learned to fear strangers. "Ella!" Julia's voice was swallowed by the music, by the laughter of people who'd never had to run from anything. If this story already speaks to your heart, don't just scroll. Subscribe and join our growing family of believers in hope and love. Tell us where in the world you're watching from. We'd love to know. She pushed through designer gowns and political handshakes, watching helplessly as her daughter stopped directly in front of Caleb Ward, the man who'd disappeared from her life without explanation. The man whose eyes Ella had inherited. The man Julia had spent 7 years making sure would never, ever find them. Ella looked up at him with the kind of innocent certainty that could destroy worlds. "I think you're my daddy." The ballroom didn't stop. The music continued. Conversations flowed. Champagne glasses clinked. But something fundamental shifted. Julia felt it in her bones, in the sudden weight of eyes turning toward them, in the way Caleb's expression drained of color. He froze, completely, utterly still. And then, slowly, his gaze lifted from the little girl with his eyes to the woman standing at the edge of the crowd, her breath caught, her world collapsing. Recognition. Julia had choreographed hundreds of dances in her life, mapped out movement and timing, and the precise moment when everything changes. But she'd never planned for this, never imagined that the past she'd buried would resurrect itself in a ballroom full of witnesses, delivered in the small, certain voice of the daughter who deserved so much better than the truth. Caleb's mouth opened. No sound came out. Someone nearby whispered, then someone else. The murmurs spread like ripples in water, and Julia knew, with the terrible clarity of someone who'd learned to recognize disaster, that by morning, everyone would know. The ruthless ward has a hidden heir. She should run. Should grab Ella and disappear again, the way she had 7 years ago when she'd learned what Caleb really was. But her feet wouldn't move. She stood paralyzed as Caleb Ward, the man she'd loved, the man she'd fled, the most dangerous person in this room, knelt down slowly in front of their daughter. His hand trembled as he reached out, then stopped, hovering in the air between them. When he finally spoke, his voice was barely a whisper. "What's your name?" "Ella Monroe. I'm 7. Do you know my mommy?" The question hung in the air like a blade. Caleb's eyes found Julia's across the crowd, and she saw everything she'd been running from: recognition, accusation, and something that looked terrifyingly like hope. The flash of cameras was the sound of her life ending for the second time. Julia's survival instincts finally kicked in, cutting through the paralysis. She moved before conscious thought, shouldering past silk and expensive perfume, reaching for Ella's hand. "We're leaving. Now." "But Mommy." "Now, Ella." The sharpness in her voice made her daughter flinch, and Julia hated herself for it. But fear had teeth and they were closing around her throat. She couldn't breathe in this ballroom anymore, couldn't stand another second of whispers spreading like poison through the crowd. Behind her, she heard Caleb's voice, low, commanding, issuing orders to the shadows that served him. His men were already moving, forming barriers, reaching for phones, trying to control the uncontrollable. Too late. It was always too late once the truth had teeth. The parking lot air hit her face like a slap, cold and merciless. Julia's heels clicked against concrete as she half-dragged Ella toward their aging Honda, keys already in her shaking hand. The charity gala, the performance, her students, abandoned. Everything abandoned. Again. "Julia." His voice stopped her mid-stride. Not because she wanted to stop, but because her body remembered before her mind could catch up. Remembered the weight of that voice, the way it used to shape her name like prayer. She turned. He stood 20 feet away, jacket open, tie loosened, looking nothing like the composed businessman from inside. He looked like a man who'd seen a ghost and couldn't decide if he wanted to embrace it or exorcise it. "Don't!" She pushed Ella behind her, a shield made of silk and maternal fury. "Don't you dare come near us!" "You think I wouldn't recognize her?" His voice was quiet, but it carried the force of 7 years' worth of questions. He took a step forward. "Those eyes, that face. She's mine." Julia's hands clenched into fists. "She's been mine for 7 years while you were... what? Building your empire? Becoming everything I was warned you'd be?" Ella peeked out from behind her mother's dress, confusion written across features too young to understand the wreckage surrounding her. "Mommy, why are you mad?" "Get in the car, baby." Julia's voice softened just for her daughter, a gentleness she couldn't extend to the man approaching them. "Lock the doors." "But..." "Now, Ella." The girl obeyed, scrambling into the back seat, and Julia heard the click of locks engaging. Good. At least one of them was safe. Even if it was only temporary. Even if safe was an illusion, Julia had stopped believing in the moment Ella's small voice had shattered 7 years of careful hiding. Caleb moved closer, and she could see the calculations behind his eyes. The same analytical precision that had once assessed business deals now turned on her. On the secret she'd kept. "I left to protect you." The words hit her like a punch. Julia actually laughed, a bitter sound that had no place in her throat. Protect me? You disappeared in the middle of the night. No note, no explanation, just gone. I woke up alone, and by noon, I was running from men who wanted to know where you'd hidden your father's money. I told them you didn't know anything. They didn't believe you. Her voice cracked. I lost everything, Caleb. My contract with the company, my apartment, my reputation. Do you know what it's like to be blacklisted from every major venue because people think you're connected to organized crime? I was trying to get out. He ran a hand through his hair, frustration bleeding through his controlled exterior. I thought if I disappeared, if I severed all connections, you'd be safe. They'd leave you alone. Well, congratulations. Your plan worked brilliantly. She gestured back toward the hotel, where silhouettes moved behind lit windows. Reporters, probably, already filing stories that would destroy what little peace she'd managed to build. Until tonight. Until our daughter walked up to you in front of half of this city's elite and asked if you were her daddy. The word hung between them. Daddy. A title he'd never earned, never even knew existed until 20 minutes ago. Why didn't you tell me? His voice dropped lower, dangerous. 7 years, Julia. Did you think I didn't have a right to know? Rights? The word tasted like acid. You forfeited your rights when you chose that life over me. Over us. She pressed her key fob, the car beeping in response. I was pregnant when you left. 2 months. I didn't know yet, but I found out 3 weeks later, alone in a motel room in Pennsylvania because I was too afraid to stay in New York. Something cracked in his expression. Pain, maybe, or regret. But Julia was past caring about his feelings. She'd spent 7 years caring too much, wondering if she'd made the right choice, if he'd ever tried to find her. Julia. No. She moved toward the car, putting distance between them. You don't get to do this. You don't get to walk back into our lives because she recognized you. We're leaving. We've gotten very good at leaving. I'm not letting you disappear again. The words stopped her with her hand on the door handle. She turned back slowly, meeting his eyes across the parking lot. You don't have a choice. I have resources, connections. If you run, I'll find you. Is that a threat? It's a promise. He took another step forward, and she could see the exhaustion in his features, the weight of whatever he'd been carrying these 7 years. I lost you once. I'm not making that mistake again. Movement at the parking lot entrance, figures with cameras, reporters who'd followed the story outside. The vultures were circling. Caleb noticed them too. His jaw tightened. We need to talk. Somewhere private. We have nothing to talk about. We have a daughter who just announced my paternity to a room full of people who trade in information. His voice took on an edge. By morning, her face will be everywhere. Do you understand what that means? Do you understand the danger you've both been in since the moment she said those words? Julia's blood went cold. She'd been so focused on escape, on the betrayal, on the past tearing open, that she hadn't thought about the future, about the targets that had just been painted on their backs. This isn't over, Caleb said quietly. It can't be. Before she could respond, before she could process the implications of his words, the reporters reached them. Questions exploded like artillery fire. Mr. Ward, is it true? Is this your daughter? How long have you... Julia wrenched open her car door, climbing inside with shaking hands. Through the windshield, she watched Caleb turn to face the cameras, his expression smoothing into the mask of the man the world expected him to be. She drove away with her daughter's questions filling the back seat and Caleb's words echoing in her mind. By morning, she knew, everything would be different. By morning, the whole world would know that the ruthless Caleb Ward had a secret he'd never known he was keeping. The photo went viral before Julia finished her second cup of coffee. It was everywhere. News sites, social media, gossip blogs that thrived on the misfortune of people like Caleb Ward. The image was striking. A powerful man kneeling before a small girl in a purple dress, his face a study in shock and something that looked dangerously like tenderness. The caption changed depending on the outlet, but the sentiment remained. Underworld king and his secret daughter? Julia's phone wouldn't stop buzzing. Parents from the dance studio, asking if she was all right. Former colleagues from New York, suddenly remembering her existence. Reporters requesting interviews, offering money for exclusive stories. She turned it off after the 10th call and focused on the only thing that mattered, keeping Ella's morning routine as normal as possible. "Mommy, why were those people taking pictures last night?" Ella asked around a mouthful of cereal. "They were just excited about the performance." The lie tasted bitter. Julia had promised herself she'd never lie to her daughter. But the truth, that their lives had just been turned inside out, that danger was coming whether they were ready or not, felt too heavy for a 7-year-old's shoulders. She drove Ella to school with one eye on the rearview mirror, cataloging every car that followed too long, every stranger who looked twice. Paranoia, maybe. Or survival instinct finally waking up after 7 years of comfortable sleep. The studio was her refuge. Julia unlocked the door at noon, planning to prep for the evening's classes, to lose herself in choreography and counts and the familiar burn of muscle memory. Dance had saved her once before, after Caleb, after the scandal, when she'd had nothing but a growing belly and a bus ticket to somewhere anonymous. It could save her again. But the moment she stepped inside, she knew something was wrong. The mirrors, 12 feet of perfect reflection that had cost her 3 months' salary, were shattered. Glass glittered across the hardwood floor like malicious stars, creating constellations of destruction. Her desk was overturned, filing cabinet emptied, papers scattered like evidence of a life ransacked. Someone had taken a baseball bat to the sound system. The baris were intact, but only barely, tilted at odd angles as if the intruders had considered destroying them too. And there, on the one remaining mirror, written in red lipstick that looked too much like blood, "You should have stayed gone." Julia's legs gave out. She sank onto the floor, glass crunching beneath her knees, unable to process the violence of it. 7 years. She'd been careful for 7 years, had built this studio from nothing, had created a life so small and quiet that no one would ever think to look for her here. One night, one moment, one daughter's innocent question, and it had all come apart. Her phone rang, the landline, because her cell was still off. She crawled to the desk, glass embedding itself in her palms, and grabbed the receiver with shaking hands. Julia Monroe's dance studio. Silence. Then breathing. Then a voice, male and unfamiliar. "Pretty little thing, your daughter. Shame if something happened to her." The line went dead. Julia threw up in the trash can, her body rejecting the terror that had nowhere else to go. She should call the police. Should report the break-in, the threat. Should do all the normal things a normal person would do when their life was being dismantled by strangers. But she'd stopped being normal the moment she fell in love with Caleb Ward. The police couldn't protect her from whatever this was. They couldn't shield Ella from people who left messages in broken glass and made threats over phone lines that shouldn't have been traceable. This wasn't random vandalism. This was a message from someone who knew exactly who she was, what she'd been running from, and where her vulnerabilities lived. She was cleaning glass from her hands when the knock came. Julia grabbed the nearest thing that could serve as a weapon, a broken bar piece, and approached the door. Through the window, she saw a man in dark clothing, Hands visible. Expression neutral. Not a reporter. Not police. Something else. Ms. Monroe? His voice was quiet, professional. My name is Ethan Cole. I work for Caleb Ward. She opened the door just wide enough to see him clearly. 30s, maybe early 40s, with the kind of face that disappeared in crowds, deliberately forgettable except for the eyes, which were sharp enough to catalog every detail of her appearance, the studio behind her, the fear she was trying to hide. I don't want anything from Caleb. He's not asking what you want. Ethan's gaze moved past her, taking in the destruction. He's sending protection whether you like it or not. I don't need... Someone broke into your studio, destroyed your property, left a threatening message. His voice remained even, factual. That was just the opening move. They wanted you to know they can reach you. The next move will be worse unless you accept help. Julia's grip tightened on the bar piece. Who are they? People who think they can leverage your daughter to get to Caleb. Ethan pulled out a phone, showed her a screen filled with text she couldn't quite read from this distance. He's received 3 demands already. Money, territory, cooperation with various criminal enterprises. They all mention Ella specifically. The world tilted. She's 7 years old, which makes her perfect leverage. Ethan pocketed the phone. I have a team ready to establish a perimeter around your home, your daughter's school, this studio. 24-hour surveillance, armed response capability. Caleb's orders. Caleb doesn't get to give orders about my life. He's trying to keep you alive. For the first time, something like emotion crossed Ethan's face. Frustration, maybe. Or the exhaustion of someone who'd had this argument before. You can hate him all you want, Ms. Monroe. But right now, he's the only thing standing between your daughter and people who see her as a commodity. Julia wanted to argue. Wanted to throw him out, call the police, pack a bag and run like she should have done 7 years ago. But the lipstick message burned in her peripheral vision, and the phone threat echoed in her ears. And she thought about Ella. Innocent, trusting Ella, sitting in a classroom right now, unaware that her existence had just made her a target. Fine. The word cost her. But I don't want to see him. I don't want him near Ella. Just keep us safe. Ethan nodded once. The team will be in place within the hour. In the meantime, I'll wait here. He stepped inside without invitation, positioning himself near the door with the ease of someone who'd spent a lifetime guarding things. Julia watched him, this stranger who worked for the man she'd loved and fled, and wondered how her life had become something that required armed guards and surveillance teams. She picked up Ella from school with Ethan following 3 cars behind, drove to dance rehearsal with her eyes constantly checking mirrors, cataloging vehicles, seeing threats in every shadow. The afternoon passed in a haze of fear and forced normalcy. Her students practicing their routines, oblivious to the fact that their teacher's world was crumbling in real time. It was after rehearsal, buckling Ella into her car seat, that Julia saw it. A black sedan, too clean for this neighborhood, windows tinted dark enough to hide faces. It had been parked across the street when they'd arrived, was still there 2 hours later, was pulling out behind them now, maintaining a careful distance. Not Ethan. He was in a gray SUV, visible in her mirror. Someone else. Julia's hands tightened on the wheel. She took a random turn, then another. The sedan followed. She accelerated, testing. It matched her speed. Ella was singing in the back seat, some song from a cartoon Julia barely registered, and all she could think was, they're following us. They know where we live. They know which school she attends. They know everything. She pulled into a coffee shop parking lot, fumbling for her phone with shaking hands. Found Caleb's number. He'd texted her that morning, a message she'd deleted without reading, but the number remained in her recent calls. He answered on the first ring. Julia. Just her name. No question, no surprise, as if he'd been waiting for this call since the moment she'd driven away from him last night. There's a car following us. Her voice came out steadier than she felt. Black sedan, tinted windows. They've been on us since we left the studio. Silence. Then, where are you? She gave him the address, heard him relay information to someone else, heard the clipped efficiency of a man who dealt with threats the way most people dealt with paperwork. Ethan's 2 minutes out, Caleb said. Stay in your car. Lock the doors. If anyone approaches, drive away and call 911. Caleb. Pack a bag. His voice was calm, too calm, the kind of calm that came from standing in the eye of hurricanes. I'm sending a car. It'll be there in an hour. I'm not leaving. You don't have a choice anymore. Something sharp entered his tone. They broke into your studio. They're following you in broad daylight. Next time, they won't just follow. Pack a bag, Julia. Enough for a few days. Bring Ella's favorite things. The car will take you somewhere safe. Where? With me. The line went dead. Julia sat in the parking lot, engine running, watching the black sedan idle at the corner. Ella had stopped singing and was watching her mother with worry creasing her small features. Mommy, are we okay? No, Julia thought. We're not okay. We haven't been okay since the moment you looked at your father and recognized something I'd tried to hide. But she smiled, the way mothers do when they're lying to protect their children. We're fine, sweetheart. We're just going on an adventure. That night, they left behind the coastal town that had promised safety. Left behind the studio Julia had built from nothing. The life she'd choreographed with such care. The illusion that distance and silence could protect them from the past. An hour later, a sleek black car pulled up to her door. Not Ethan this time, but another of Caleb's shadows, offering a hand she had no choice but to take. Julia loaded their hastily packed bags into the trunk, buckled Ella into the back seat, and watched her small house disappear in the rearview mirror. 7 years of hiding, of building, of pretending the past was dead and buried. All of it, gone in a single night. All of it, because she'd loved the wrong man and borne him a daughter who had his eyes. The estate appeared through the morning mist like something out of a Gothic novel. All stone and iron, gates that looked designed to keep out armies rather than unwanted visitors. Julia pressed her face against the car window, watching as they approached what could only be described as a fortress dressed in old money. The property sprawled across acres of manicured grounds, protected by walls that seemed to go on forever. Security cameras tracked their progress up the long driveway. Men in dark suits stood at intervals, earpieces visible, hands positioned near concealed weapons. This wasn't a home. It was a compound. A stronghold for someone who had enough enemies to require this level of protection. It's like a castle, Ella breathed, unconsciously echoing the words she'd spoken at the gala. A real one. Julia's stomach twisted. To her daughter, this was an adventure. To Julia, it was a cage wrapped in luxury, a reminder of everything she'd run from, everything she'd sworn Ella would never be exposed to. The main house rose 3 stories, ivy climbing stone walls that had probably stood for a century. Tall windows reflected the morning sun, making it impossible to see inside. The architecture spoke of old wealth, the kind that had been accumulating interest when Julia's family was still struggling to make rent in Queens. The car stopped at the front entrance. A woman emerged before Julia could even unbuckle Ella's seatbelt. Late 30s, dark hair pulled back in a severe bun, wearing slacks and a blazer that managed to look both professional and intimidating. Ms. Monroe, I'm Mia Torres. Her handshake was firm, her eyes assessing. I manage Mr. Ward's household. I'll show you to your rooms. Not guest rooms, Your rooms. As if this were already decided, already permanent. Julia carried their bags while Ella bounced ahead, unbothered by the gravity of their situation. Children were resilient that way, adaptable in ways adults had forgotten how to be. Or maybe Ella just didn't understand yet that they'd traded freedom for safety, that the walls keeping danger out also kept them trapped inside. The interior matched the exterior's grandeur. Marble floors, artwork that belonged in museums, furniture that had never seen the inside of a department store. Everything pristine, everything cold, everything designed to impress rather than comfort. Julia's entire studio could have fit in the entrance hall. "Mr. Ward is in meetings," Mia said as she led them up a sweeping staircase. "He asked me to make sure you have everything you need. The East Wing has been prepared for you. 2 bedrooms, private bathroom, sitting area. There's a library down the hall, a gym on the 3rd floor, and the grounds are secure if Ella wants to play outside." "We're not staying long." Julia's voice sounded small in the cavernous space. Mia paused mid-step, turned back with an expression that might have been sympathy. "That's between you and Mr. Ward. My job is to make you comfortable while you're here." The rooms were beautiful. Julia had to admit that much. Ella's bedroom was larger than their entire apartment had been, with a 4-poster bed, built-in bookshelves, and windows overlooking gardens that stretched toward distant woods. Someone had already stocked it with toys, books, art supplies. As if they'd known a child was coming. As if this had all been planned. "Did Caleb arrange all this?" Julia asked, watching Ella dive into a pile of stuffed animals. "He sent specifications last night." Mia straightened a picture frame that didn't need straightening. Age 7, loves purple, interested in art and dance. He wanted her to feel at home. The thoughtfulness of it caught Julia off guard. The Caleb she'd known 7 years ago had been passionate, yes, and attentive in ways that had made her feel like the center of his universe. But this, preparing a room for a daughter he'd learned about less than 24 hours ago, spoke to something she hadn't expected. Intentionality. Investment. It terrified her. "I'll leave you to settle in," Mia said. "Dinner is at 7. Someone will come collect you." Julia spent the next hour unpacking their meager belongings, trying to make the palatial rooms feel less like a gilded cage. But everything here was temporary. Had to be temporary. They'd stay until the threats passed, until Caleb's people neutralized whoever had broken into her studio. Then they'd leave. Find somewhere new. Start over again. She'd done it once. She could do it again. Except Ella had already found the art supplies and was creating what could only be described as a masterpiece of childhood optimism. Stick figures in crayon, labeled with careful 7-year-old handwriting. Me, Mommy, Daddy. 3 figures holding hands. A house with a smoking chimney. A sun with an oversized smile. "That's beautiful, sweetheart," Julia managed, her throat tight. "I'm gonna give it to Daddy." Ella didn't look up, focused on adding flowers to the garden. "So he knows we're a family now." Julia knelt beside her daughter, choosing her words with the precision of someone defusing a bomb. "Baby, this is just temporary. We're here because it's safe, but Daddy wants us here. I can tell." Ella's certainty was the kind that only children possessed. Absolute. Unshakable. Untainted by adult complications. "He has my eyes, Mommy. That means we belong together." How do you explain to a 7-year-old that biology doesn't equal family? That her father was dangerous? That his world consumed people? That staying here meant risking everything Julia had spent years protecting her from? You don't. You can't. So you lie with silence and let your daughter believe in fairy tales a little longer. 3 days passed in a strange limbo. Julia saw Caleb only in glimpses, through windows as he crossed the grounds with Ethan, at breakfast before he disappeared into his study for hours, late at night when she heard his footsteps in the corridor beyond their wing. He was giving them space, maybe. Or avoiding the confrontation they both knew was inevitable. Ella, meanwhile, had no such reservations. She explored every hall, made friends with the kitchen staff, and left a trail of drawings everywhere she went. On counters, tucked under doors, taped to mirrors. Little pieces of childhood innocence scattered through a house that had forgotten what innocence looked like. Julia found one of them on the 4th day, purely by accident. She'd been looking for Ella, following the sound of laughter to Caleb's study. The door was ajar, and through the gap, she saw her daughter sitting on the edge of a massive mahogany desk, showing Caleb something on a tablet while he leaned back in his chair, listening with an expression of complete attention. "And this one is a pirouette," Ella was explaining, demonstrating with her finger on the screen. "Mommy says I'm almost good enough to do them without falling." "I'd like to see that sometime." Caleb's voice was different here. Softer, careful, like he was handling something precious and breakable. "You could come to my next recital." "If Mommy says it's okay." A pause. "I'd like that very much." Julia should have left then, should have given them privacy. But she found herself frozen, watching this man she'd loved and feared interact with the daughter he'd never known existed. There was wonder in his expression, mixed with something that looked like grief. For all the moments he'd missed, maybe, or for the life they might have had if things had been different. Then she saw them. Drawings spread across his desk, dozens of them. Stick figure families, purple flowers, hearts with daddy written inside. 7 years' worth of absence compressed into crayon and construction paper. Caleb picked up one, the first one Ella had made, with the 3 of them holding hands, and something in his expression shifted. The careful control he always wore slipped just enough to reveal the man underneath. He smiled, not the cold, calculated expression he showed the world, but something genuine, something that looked dangerously like hope. Julia stepped into the doorway before she could stop herself. "Ella, it's time for lunch." Both of them turned. Ella hopped off the desk with the easy grace of a child who'd inherited her mother's dancer's body. Caleb's expression shuddered immediately, the moment of vulnerability disappearing behind his usual mask. "But Mommy, I was showing Daddy my dancing videos." "Now please." Julia kept her voice even but firm. Ella huffed but obeyed, squeezing past her mother with a pout that said she knew something important had been interrupted. Her footsteps faded down the corridor, leaving Julia and Caleb alone in a study filled with evidence of their daughter's desperate attempt to build a family from broken pieces. "Don't let her think this is normal," Julia said quietly. Caleb stood slowly, moving around the desk but maintaining distance. "What's normal? A childhood without a father? Better than a childhood in your world." "My world is keeping her alive right now." His voice remained level, but she heard the edge beneath it. "Or have you forgotten why you're here?" "I haven't forgotten anything." She glanced at the drawings, at the proof of Ella's hope spread across expensive wood. "That's the problem. I remember exactly what your world does to people." "I left to protect you." "So you've said." "How's that working out?" She gestured vaguely toward the windows, toward the guards and gates and cameras. "Seems like leaving just delayed the inevitable." Before he could respond, a voice cut through the tension. "Julia, could I speak with you for a moment?" Mia stood in the doorway, her expression neutral but urgent. Julia followed her into the hall, grateful for the interruption even as unease coiled in her stomach. Once they were alone, Mia's professional demeanor cracked slightly. "I know this isn't what you wanted. Being here, being near him again. You don't know anything about what I want. I know he's trying to change." Mia's voice dropped lower. "For her, maybe. For you. But his world doesn't let people leave clean, Julia. There are debts, obligations, enemies who've been waiting years for an opening like this. What are you saying? I'm saying that drawing stick figure families and putting her to bed at night doesn't erase what he is, what he's built, the people he's crossed. Mia glanced back toward the study. He can try to be a father. He can want to be different. But wanting isn't enough when there are men out there who see your daughter as leverage. The words settled like stones in Julia's chest. Then why keep us here? Why not send us somewhere he can't find us? Because he already loves her. Mia's expression was almost pitying. I've known Caleb Ward for 15 years. I've never seen him love anything except power and control. But he looks at that little girl like she's the first good thing he's ever been given. He won't let you leave. Not now. Not when he's just found you. Julia returned to their wing with Mia's warning echoing in her mind. She made Ella lunch, supervised homework, pretended everything was fine while her thoughts spiraled through possibilities. Escape routes, contingency plans, ways to get them out before they became too entangled in Caleb's dangerous world. That night, she woke to voices, not conversation, shouting. Caleb's voice, muffled by distance and walls, but unmistakable in its fury. Julia checked on Ella, still sleeping, thank God, and crept into the hallway. The house was dark except for light spilling from beneath a door on the first floor. His study. She moved closer, keeping to shadows the way she'd learned to do years ago when knowing Caleb's business could mean the difference between safety and danger. I don't care what Vincent wants. Caleb's voice carried up the stairs. He moves against me. He loses everything. A pause. Someone speaking on the other end of a phone call. He already made it personal when he targeted my studio. Another pause. Yes, I know it's a trap. I don't care. No one touches my family. My family. The words hit Julia like a physical blow. In his mind, they were already his. Claimed, protected, possessed the way Caleb Ward possessed everything valuable in his life. Tell Vincent I'll meet him, but on my terms, my location. And Ethan? Caleb's voice dropped to something deadly. Make sure he knows what happens to people who threaten children. The call ended. Silence flooded the house. Julia stood frozen in the hallway, her heart hammering against her ribs. Vincent Hale. She knew that name. Everyone who'd ever been connected to Caleb's world knew that name. His rival, his enemy, the one man who'd been trying to dismantle Caleb's empire for years. And now he was moving. Against them. The past Julia had spent 7 years running from wasn't just catching up. It was closing in, fast and violent, and she had nowhere left to run. The article dropped at dawn, and with it, any remaining illusion of control. Julia saw it on her phone before she'd even gotten out of bed, pushed to her screen by news alerts she'd forgotten to disable. The headline alone was enough to make her stomach drop. The King's Weakness. Caleb Ward's Secret Family Exposed. By Natalie Pierce. Below it, the photo from the gala. But this version had been cropped, enhanced, turned into something that looked less like a moment of shock and more like a portrait of vulnerability. Caleb kneeling, Ella looking down at him with those unmistakable eyes, Julia frozen in the background like a ghost from his past come to haunt him. The article was worse than the photo. Natalie Pierce. Julia vaguely recognized the name from investigative pieces that had taken down politicians and business moguls, had done her homework. She'd traced Julia's history, her career as a ballet prodigy in New York, her sudden disappearance 7 years ago, her resurfacing in a coastal town under the same name, but a completely different life. She'd found former colleagues willing to speculate about Julia's relationship with Caleb, neighbors willing to describe the quiet woman who kept to herself, parents from the dance studio expressing shock that their children's teacher had been hiding such a dramatic past. And Ella. God, they'd included details about Ella. Her school, her age. Enough information that anyone with resources could find them. Pierce had stopped just short of publishing their address, but it was there between the lines. A map for anyone determined enough to follow. The final paragraphs were the killing blow. In the ruthless world Caleb Ward inhabits, family is currency, and sentiment is weakness. Sources close to his organization suggest that this revelation, of a daughter he never knew existed, of a woman he apparently loved enough to let disappear, has already begun to shift the balance of power. A man with something to lose can't make the hard choices, one anonymous associate told this reporter. And in Ward's world, that makes you prey. Vincent Hale, Ward's primary rival, declined to comment. But sources indicate he's already making moves, capitalizing on what many in the underworld are calling Ward's sudden vulnerability. The question now isn't whether Hale will strike, but when, and whether Ward's newfound family will survive the fallout. Julia read it twice, then a third time, each pass making her feel sicker. This wasn't just journalism. This was a declaration of war, printed in ink and distributed to millions. Natalie Pierce had taken their private crisis and weaponized it, turned Ella into a target, and Julia into the woman who'd made Caleb Ward weak. She found him in his study an hour later, surrounded by men in dark suits who fell silent the moment she entered. Ethan was there, his usually neutral expression tight with concern. Owen Briggs, Caleb's strategist, a man Julia had met once and immediately disliked, stood with arms crossed, his face a mask of barely controlled frustration. And Caleb, seated behind his desk, looked like a man staring at the ruins of everything he'd built. "We need to talk," Julia said, ignoring the other men. "Not now." His voice was flat, drained of the warmth she'd heard when he spoke to Ella. "Yes, now." She stepped further into the room, refusing to be intimidated by the testosterone and barely concealed violence radiating from every corner. "I just read Natalie Pierce's article. How did she get that information?" "We're handling it," Ethan said quietly. "Handling it?" Julia laughed. A bitter sound. "She knows where Ella goes to school. She practically drew a map to our front door. You call that handling it?" "Ms. Monroe, perhaps you should let us," Owen began, but Julia cut him off. Don't patronize me. I've been running from this world for 7 years. I know exactly what that article means." "Then you know you need to leave." Owen's tone sharpened. "Let the men in this room do what needs to be done without worrying about collateral damage." The words hung in the air like a slap. Collateral damage. That's what she and Ella were to him. Complications to be managed. Obstacles to be removed. "Owen." Caleb's voice carried a warning, but Owen wasn't finished. He turned to Caleb, and Julia saw something dangerous in his expression. Doubt, maybe, or the kind of ambition that thrived in moments of weakness. "With respect, sir, we need to address the reality of this situation. Hale's going to use them. The longer they stay here, the more vulnerable we become. We need to strike first, hard, decisive, before he has time to organize his resources." "Strike how?" Julia demanded. "That's not your concern." "It is when you're talking about starting a war over my daughter." "We didn't start this war," Owen shot back. "Your daughter did. The moment she walked up to Caleb Ward at a public event and announced his paternity to a room full of witnesses. We're just trying to survive it." "Owen, that's enough." Caleb stood, his voice dropping to something cold and absolute. "This conversation is over." "No, it's not." Owen held his ground, and Julia realized she was watching something fracture. The command structure Caleb had spent years building, beginning to crack under the weight of this new vulnerability. "Your men are questioning your judgment." They see you hesitating, refusing to take the obvious actions because you're worried about a woman who ran from you and a child you've known for less than a week. A man with something to lose isn't a leader. He's prey. The silence that followed was the kind that preceded violence. Julia watched Caleb's hands curl into fists, watched the careful control he always maintained threaten to snap. But before anyone could move, Ethan stepped between them. Owen, outside, now. I'm not wrong. But Owen moved toward the door, his eyes still on Caleb. Every minute we wait, Hale gets stronger. Every second you spend playing house with them, your empire gets weaker. You need to decide what matters more, being a father or being a king. He left. The door closed behind him with the finality of a coffin lid. Julia found herself breathing too fast, her heart racing with a cocktail of fear and fury. She'd spent 7 years protecting Ella from exactly this, from a world where children were leverage and family was weakness, where love made you vulnerable and vulnerability got you killed. Julia, Caleb began. He's right. The words cost her, but they were true. I've made you weak. Just by being here, by bringing Ella into your life, we've given your enemies exactly what they need to destroy you. That's not, isn't it? She gestured toward where Owen had stood. Your own strategist just questioned your leadership. How long before the others do the same? How long before someone decides they'd be better off without you, or with someone who isn't distracted by trying to protect a family he never even knew he wanted? Caleb moved around the desk, closing the distance between them. Owen is ambitious and ruthless and occasionally stupid, but he doesn't speak for my organization. Doesn't he? Julia held her ground even as he approached. He said what everyone's thinking. That article made it clear Caleb Ward has something to lose now. And in your world, that's the same as painting a target on our backs. So what do you want me to do? His voice dropped, something raw bleeding through the control. Send you away? Pretend I don't have a daughter? Go back to being the man I was before I knew she existed? I want... Julia stopped, because she didn't know what she wanted anymore. Safety for Ella, yes, but also, what? For this to be different? For Caleb to be different? For love to be enough to protect them from the violence his world promised? Before she could answer, her phone buzzed. Then Ethan's. Then Caleb's. All at once, like a coordinated alarm. Ethan looked at his screen, and his face drained of color. Sir. The word was cut off by a sound that Julia felt in her bones before she heard it. A low rumble that built into a roar, followed by a concussion that rattled the windows. Somewhere in the distance, an explosion bloomed against the morning sky, smoke rising in a black column that could be seen even from the estate. The warehouse. Ethan was already moving, phone pressed to his ear. The one on Port Street. It's gone. Julia watched the smoke rise, watched Caleb's expression shift from shock to something colder. Something that reminded her exactly who he was beneath the careful father he'd been trying to become. This was the man she'd run from, the one who inhabited a world where warehouses exploded and people died and war was waged with fire and blood. Get everyone to safe positions, Caleb said, his voice stripped of emotion. Full defensive protocols. I want eyes on every property we own. If Hale's moving, I want to know before his people get within a mile of anything that matters to us. And them? Ethan glanced toward Julia. Caleb's eyes found hers across the room, and she saw the calculation happening behind them, weighing options, measuring risks, deciding how to protect people who'd made him vulnerable. Lockdown. No one leaves the estate. Triple the guard rotation. If anyone unauthorized comes within sight of the gates, I want to know about it. Men moved with practiced efficiency, disappearing to execute orders. Within minutes, the study was empty except for Julia and Caleb, the smoke still visible through the windows. a reminder that the war they'd been waiting for had finally begun. "This is because of us," Julia said quietly. "That warehouse, those people, they're casualties of the weakness we created." "No." Caleb moved to the window, staring at the destruction in the distance. "This is because Vincent Hale is a psychopath who's been waiting for any excuse to move against me. You and Ella didn't start this war. You just gave him a convenient opening." Convenient. The word tasted bitter. "Is that what we are to you? Convenient?" He turned, and the expression on his face was nothing like the careful control he usually wore. "You're everything I didn't know I needed until I saw her looking up at me with my eyes. You're the reason I'm going to survive this, because I finally have something worth protecting that isn't power, or money, or reputation. You're not convenient, Julia. You're essential, and that terrifies me more than any war Vincent Hale could possibly wage." The honesty of it left her speechless. This was the Caleb she'd fallen in love with 7 years ago. The one who could strip away pretense and speak truths that hurt and heal in equal measure. But it was also the Caleb she'd run from. The one whose world demanded blood payment for sentiment. "Mommy!" They both turned. Ella stood in the doorway, still in her pajamas, holding one of her drawings. She looked small and scared and utterly unaware that the smoke visible through the window was part of a war being fought over her existence. "What was that noise?" she asked. Julia crossed to her daughter, kneeling down to her level, searching for words that would be true without being terrifying. "Just an accident, sweetheart. Everything's okay." But as she said it, watching smoke continue to rise against the morning sky, Julia knew that nothing was okay. The war had begun, and they were standing at the center of it. A woman who'd run from violence, a child who deserved better than this life, and a man who'd finally found something worth more than his empire. And somewhere out there, Vincent Hale was planning his next move, waiting for the moment when Caleb Ward's newfound weakness would become the opening he needed to destroy everything. The question wasn't whether the attack would come, it was whether any of them would survive it. The gunfire came at 3 in the morning, distant enough to be confused with thunder if you didn't know better. But Julia knew better. She'd spent enough time in Caleb's world to recognize the difference between weather and warfare. She stood at the window of her bedroom, watching lights flash in the distance near what she assumed were the docks. Muzzle flashes, maybe. Or vehicles arriving and departing in patterns too coordinated to be random. The estate's security had tripled. She'd counted at least 15 new faces in the past 12 hours. But Caleb himself was gone. Had been since the warehouse explosion. Ella slept in the next room, exhausted from a day spent drawing pictures that Julia had carefully hidden away. Not wanting her daughter to leave more evidence of their existence scattered through a house that felt less like a home and more like a fortress under siege. The minutes crawled past. Julia made tea she didn't drink, paced halls she was learning to navigate by memory, and tried not to think about what was happening at those docks. Tried not to imagine Caleb in the middle of it, giving orders, making decisions, doing whatever men like him did when their empires were threatened. Dawn came slowly, painting the sky in shades of gray that matched her mood. She was in the kitchen when she heard the cars return. Engines cutting, doors slamming, voices urgent but controlled. Julia moved to the window and saw them. Black SUVs pulled up to the side entrance, men emerging with weapons visible, moving with the exhausted efficiency of soldiers returning from battle. And Caleb, stepping out of the lead vehicle, looked like he'd walked through hell and barely made it back. Blood covered his shirt, arterial spray patterns that Julia recognized from the 1 semester of pre-med she'd taken before switching to dance. His jacket was gone, his hair disheveled, and even from this distance, she could see the tremor in his hands as he spoke to Ethan. Julia's feet moved before her brain engaged, carrying her through the house toward the side entrance. She met him in the corridor, and up close, the damage was worse. Blood on his face, his neck, soaked into his clothes. A cut above his eyebrow that had stopped bleeding but would scar. The look in his eyes of a man who'd done things he couldn't take back. "You're hurt," she said, reaching for him instinctively. "It's not mine." His voice was flat, mechanical. "Most of it, anyway." "Most of it?" "It's handled." He moved past her, heading toward his study with the single-minded purpose of someone running on adrenaline and necessity. "I need to make calls. Secure the remaining assets. Make sure Hale understands what happens when he moves against me." Julia followed, watching him pour a drink with shaking hands, watching him try to become the controlled strategist his organization needed while his body betrayed the cost of the night's violence. What happened at the docks? What needed to happen? He downed the whiskey in one swallow, poured another. "Hale sent a team to hit our shipment routes. We were waiting." "Were people killed?" The pause told her everything she needed to know. "Yes." "How many? Does it matter?" He turned to face her, and she saw the fractures forming, the careful separation between the man trying to be a father and the man who'd just orchestrated what sounded like a massacre. "They came armed. They came intending to destroy what's mine." I responded accordingly. "Accordingly." Julia tasted the word, found it bitter. "You mean you killed them?" "I protected what matters." His eyes held hers, challenging her to judge him, to condemn him for doing exactly what she'd known he was capable of since the moment she'd run 7 years ago. "Would you prefer I let them succeed? Let Hale think he can strike without consequences?" Before she could answer, a knock interrupted them. Mia entered without waiting for permission, her expression tight with something that looked like concern mixed with urgency. "We need to talk," she said, glancing at Julia before focusing on Caleb. "Privately. Anything you need to say, you can say in front of her." Mia hesitated, then nodded. Someone inside gave Hale the routes. Exact timing, shipment contents, security details. This wasn't a leak, Caleb. It was betrayal. The words settled like stones in water, ripples spreading outward. Julia watched Caleb's expression shift from exhausted to dangerous. Watched the last remnants of humanity drain from his features as the reality of what Mia was saying took hold. "You're sure?" His voice had dropped to something deadly quiet. Ethan confirmed it. The information Hale had was too specific, too detailed. Only 5 people knew those routes. Mia pulled out a tablet, showed him something Julia couldn't see from her angle. "We've been tracking communications. There's a pattern." "Who?" Mia's expression answered before her words did. "Owen." Julia felt the air leave the room. Owen Briggs, the strategist who'd questioned Caleb's judgment, who'd sneered about weakness and prey, who'd argued for striking first. He'd been feeding information to their enemy. For how long? Since before the gala? Since before Julia and Ella had even entered the picture? "Get him here." Caleb's words were ice and violence compressed into 3 syllables. "Now." Mia left. Julia wanted to leave too. Wanted to take Ella and disappear into the East Wing where children's drawings and pretend normalcy could insulate them from what was about to happen. But she stayed, compelled by some terrible need to witness this. To see exactly who Caleb Ward was when betrayal stripped away his careful control. Owen arrived 15 minutes later, flanked by 2 of Caleb's men who looked more like executioners than escorts. His confidence from yesterday had evaporated, replaced by the kind of fear that came from knowing you'd been caught, and there was no talking your way out. "Sit," Caleb commanded, gesturing to the chair across from his desk. Owen sat, his eyes darting between Caleb and the men by the door, calculating odds that didn't exist. If this is about last night, it's about the last 6 months. Caleb remained standing, a predator circling prey. How long have you been feeding information to Vincent Hale? I don't. The word cracked like a whip. We have the communications, the timestamps, the payments to an offshore account you thought was untraceable. Mia's been watching you since before the gala, Owen. We just didn't know what we were watching for until Hale showed up with information only you could have provided. Owen's face went through a series of calculations: denial, anger, resignation. He settled on defiance. You were compromised, distracted by old sentiment and a woman who ran from you. Someone had to think about the organization's future. So you sold me out to my enemy. I secured alternatives. Owen leaned forward, some of his old arrogance returning. Hale approached me months ago, offered partnership, protection, a seat at the table when your empire collapsed under the weight of your own sentimentality. I took the smart play. The smart play. Caleb's laugh was devoid of humor. You betrayed everything we built because you thought I was weak. You are weak. Owen's voice rose, the words spilling out like poison that had been festering. That woman and her daughter walk into your life and suddenly you're playing house instead of running an empire. You refuse to make hard choices, refuse to strike when you need to, refuse to do what's necessary because you're worried about being a father to a child who doesn't even know you. She's 7 years old. She's a liability. Owen stood, his hands slamming onto the desk. Every second she stays under your protection, you become more vulnerable. Hale sees it. Your men see it. I saw it. A man with something to lose isn't a leader. He's a target waiting to be exploited. So you decided to do the exploiting yourself. I decided to survive. Owen's expression hardened into something cold and calculating. Hale's going to win this war, Caleb. With or without my help. He's going to tear your organization apart piece by piece, until there's nothing left but the memory of a man who let love make him stupid. I just chose to be on the winning side. The silence that followed was the kind that preceded executions. Julia watched from her position near the wall, horrified but unable to look away, as Caleb reached into his desk drawer and pulled out a gun. The same kind of gun she'd once found hidden in his apartment 7 years ago. The one that had confirmed every fear she'd had about who he really was. Caleb, she started, but he raised a hand. Leave, Julia. Don't do this. Leave. His eyes never left Owen. Take Ella somewhere she can't hear. Do it now. Every instinct screamed at her to stay, to stop this, to prevent the violence that was about to fracture whatever humanity Caleb had managed to reclaim. But she also saw the truth in his expression. This was who he was, who he'd always been. A man capable of love and devotion and tenderness with his daughter, but also capable of this, of cold, calculated violence against those who betrayed him. She left, walked down corridors that suddenly felt too long, climbed stairs that seemed to multiply with each step. Behind her, she heard voices. Owen pleading now, the arrogance stripped away, replaced by the desperate bargaining of a man who'd gambled his life and lost. Then, cutting through the morning silence, a gunshot. Single. Final. Absolute. Julia's legs gave out halfway up the staircase. She sank onto the steps, hands pressed over her mouth, trying to contain the sound that wanted to escape. She'd known what Caleb was, had always known. But knowing and witnessing were different countries, separated by a border made of blood and gunpowder. Footsteps approached. She looked up to find Caleb standing at the base of the stairs, the gun gone but the violence still visible in the set of his shoulders, the blood on his clothes, the empty look in his eyes. It's done, he said quietly. You killed him. Not a question, a statement of fact that needed to be spoken aloud. He betrayed us, put you and Ella at risk. Sold information that got good people killed. Caleb climbed the stairs slowly, each step deliberate. What did you expect me to do? Not that. Never that. But even as she said it, Julia knew she was lying to herself. She'd always known what would happen to people who threatened what Caleb considered his. She'd just never had to watch it happen in real time, in a house where her daughter slept upstairs, in a life that was supposed to be about second chances and new beginnings. He stopped beside her, and she could smell the cordite and blood, could feel the residual violence radiating from him like heat. I'm trying to be different. For her, for you. But my world doesn't allow for mercy, Julia. Not when the alternative is watching everything I love burn, because I was too weak to do what needed doing. So you choose violence. I choose survival. He sat beside her on the stairs, and the exhaustion finally showed through. The weight of the night's battles, the cost of the betrayal, the terrible burden of being exactly who he'd always been. Owen was right about one thing. Having something to lose changes you. Makes you vulnerable in ways that can be exploited, but it also gives you something worth fighting for, worth killing for, if necessary. Julia looked at him. This man she'd loved, fled from, tried to forget, and somehow ended up back with anyway. He was covered in blood and violence and the consequences of choices she could barely comprehend. But he was also Ella's father, the man who'd smiled at stick figure drawings and listened with complete attention as a 7-year-old explained pirouettes. He existed in the space between those two realities, balanced on a knife's edge between devotion and destruction. I can't do this, she whispered. Can't raise Ella in a world where people get shot in studies and wars start over warehouse explosions. Then where can you raise her? His voice was gentle, despite everything. Hale knows about her now. So does everyone else in my world. Running won't protect her anymore, Julia. The only thing that can protect her is me. The truth of it settled like a weight on her chest. She was trapped. Not by walls or guards or locked doors, but by the simple reality that her daughter's existence had made them targets. And the only person powerful enough to keep them safe was the same person whose world had made them vulnerable in the first place. What happens now? She asked. Caleb stood, offering her his hand. Now, I finish this war. Make sure Hale understands what happens to people who threaten my family. And then... He paused, something almost vulnerable crossing his features. Then I figure out how to be the father Ella deserves while still being ruthless enough to keep her alive. Julia took his hand, let him pull her to her feet, and wondered if such a balance was even possible, or if they were all just pretending that love could coexist with violence, that family could survive in a world built on blood and power. Upstairs, Ella would wake soon, would ask questions about the noises, about why her father looked so tired, about when they could go home. And Julia would lie with smiles and simple explanations, the way parents do when the truth is too terrible for childhood. But she couldn't lie to herself. The man she'd loved 7 years ago was gone. In his place stood someone more complicated, a father trying to protect his daughter, a king trying to hold his empire, a man balanced precariously between the humanity he was trying to reclaim and the violence his world demanded. And Julia would have to decide if she could love him anyway. The storm had been building all day. By nightfall, the windows of Caleb Ward's estate trembled under sheets of rain, thunder rolling low over the hills. Julia Monroe sat at the kitchen counter, laptop open, fingers moving fast. Her hair was pulled back, sleeves rolled, and every nerve in her body was on fire. It wasn't just adrenaline. It was rage. Cold, precise, long overdue. Ryan Maddox sat across from her, nursing a cup of black coffee that had gone cold an hour ago. The bartender turned informant had a knack for keeping calm when the air crackled with danger. "You sure about this?" he asked, voice low. "No," Julia said, eyes never leaving the screen. "But I'm tired of waiting for someone else to decide what happens to me." She had spent too many nights trapped inside this mansion, watching guards patrol the gates, listening to Caleb whisper orders she wasn't supposed to hear. For weeks, she'd been protected, but protection felt too close to imprisonment. Tonight, she was done being a ghost in her own life. Ryan leaned forward. "Once you open that firewall, they'll know someone's in their system. You'll have maybe 5 minutes before it pings their server. Then let's make them count." She entered the last code Ethan had helped her memorize from the security logs, an old access key tied to one of Vincent Hale's charities. The page flickered once, then again, before collapsing into a hidden database. Her stomach twisted. "Got it," Ryan murmured. "Charity accounts, donor lists, offshore ledgers. Holy hell, he's been laundering millions through public schools and cancer research funds." Julia scrolled faster. The documents blurred past. Shell companies, transactions, and finally, something personal. "Look at this," she whispered, clicking open a restricted file. Inside were transcripts of recorded calls. Her blood froze as she read the first line. "Ward, Alexander. Termination approved. Order by V. Hale." Her hands went still. "Caleb's father," she breathed. Ryan's eyes darkened. Hale ordered the hit. The next file was worse. Subject: Monroe, Julia. Objective: acquire minor, Ella Monroe. Purpose: leverage against Ward. Julia's throat closed. She scrolled, unable to stop herself, even when the words blurred with panic. Method: stage accident or abduction. To be executed by week's end. "Oh my God!" Ryan reached over, steadying her hand before she crushed the laptop. "You need to show him. Now." Julia pushed back from the counter, breath coming in sharp bursts. Her reflection in the window looked like someone she barely recognized. Pale, furious, unshakable. She had danced on stages across the world, lived through heartbreak, motherhood, and survival. But this was war. "I'll tell him," she said. "And then I'm ending this." Caleb was in his study, leaning over a map spread across the desk when she entered. The dim light caught the scar near his jaw, the one she'd traced with her thumb years ago when he was just Caleb. Not Ward, not the name whispered in fear. "Julia," he said, voice tired. "It's late." "So's your honesty." He looked up then, surprised at her tone. She walked to the desk, placed the open laptop in front of him, and said, "You need to see this." He scanned the screen, slowly at first, then faster, until his knuckles turned white. When he reached the bottom of the file, he went very still. The silence stretched until Julia thought she'd scream. Finally, he whispered, "You shouldn't have done this." Her heartbeat thundered. "Excuse me?" He looked up at her, and for the first time since she'd known him, there was fear in his eyes. "You broke into Hale's server. He'll trace the breach. He'll come for you first." Julia stepped closer. "You mean he'll come for us? Because you made this world, Caleb. And I'm done pretending it doesn't exist." "You don't understand what he's capable of." "I do," she snapped. "He killed your father. He tried to take my daughter. What else is there to understand?" His hands slammed against the desk, the sound cracking through the room. "You think this is about vengeance? It's about survival. Every move I make decides who lives and who doesn't. Then let me decide for once. she said quietly. Because hiding hasn't saved anyone. For a long moment, he just stared at her. Rain hitting the windows, lightning cutting across his face. The air between them felt alive, pulsing with anger, with memory, with something neither could name anymore. "You've changed," he said finally. "No," she whispered. "You just stopped looking." The words hit harder than she meant them to. Caleb turned away, running a hand through his hair. When he spoke again, his voice was low, rough. "When I left, I told myself it was mercy, that keeping you out of this life was the only good thing I could do. But maybe it was just fear. Fear that you'd see who I really am and never look at me again." Julia's throat tightened. "You don't get to rewrite history." "Caleb, you left. You broke me. And you didn't come back until it was too late." His eyes met hers, and something unspoken passed between them. Regret, maybe, or recognition of everything they'd both lost. Then he said softly, "Maybe it isn't too late." The words hung there, fragile and dangerous. Julia swallowed hard. "You're right about one thing. It's not over, but I'm not waiting for you to save us." "Julia." "No," she cut in. "Let him come. Let Hale come for me. Because this time, I'll be ready." Her voice didn't tremble. Neither did her hands. And that's when Caleb realized what he was seeing wasn't recklessness. It was resolve. The woman he once loved had been gentle, hopeful, fragile. The one standing before him now was steel wrapped in fire. He took a slow step closer. "You'd go to war for me?" "For Ella," she corrected. "And for myself, because I'm tired of being afraid of men who think love is something they get to control." His mouth twitched. Not quite a smile, not quite sorrow. "Then you'll need to understand what comes next." "I already do." Lightning flashed again, lighting their faces in silver. For one heartbeat, the world outside ceased to exist. Just two people who'd burned down their pasts and were standing in the ashes together. Caleb's voice dropped to a whisper. "You remind me of my mother. She used to say there's a difference between surviving and living. I didn't get it until now." Julia exhaled, her anger fading into something quieter, more dangerous. "Then stop surviving, Caleb. Start living like you want something better for her." He stepped forward, reaching for her hand, but she pulled back. "Not yet," she said softly. "You still have work to do." Hours later, long after she left his study, Caleb remained where she'd stood. The rain had stopped. The thunder was gone. Only the faint hum of the estate's security filled the silence. On the desk, her laptop still glowed with the file she'd found. Vincent Hale's signature, a list of names, the blueprint of a man's empire built on blood. For years, Caleb had ruled through fear, believing it was the only language men like him understood. But Julia had just rewritten the rules. He picked up the phone. "Ethan," he said, "wake the men. We end this tomorrow." In her room upstairs, Julia sat on the edge of her bed, unable to sleep. The house felt different now. Not safer, but sharper, like it was waiting for something to break. She could still see Caleb's face when she told him. The shock, the fear, the pride he tried to hide. It wasn't satisfaction she felt, but clarity. For years, she'd measured her worth by how small she could make herself to survive. Tonight, she finally took up space. The door creaked. Ella's small voice whispered, "Mommy?" Julia turned. "Hey, baby. Can't sleep?" Ella climbed onto the bed, curling up beside her. "I had a dream. The man from the party was there again." Julia's heart clenched. "Caleb?" Her daughter nodded sleepily. He said he was sorry. He said he'd fix everything. Julia brushed a curl from her daughter's face and pressed a kiss to her forehead. Maybe he will, she whispered. But you don't need him to. You've got me. As Ella drifted off, Julia looked out the window toward the dark line of the horizon. Somewhere out there, Vincent Hale was preparing for war. She could feel it in her bones. But for the first time in a long time, she wasn't afraid. She was ready. Downstairs, Caleb stood by the window, watching the rain ease into mist. He thought about Julia, her defiance, her courage, the fire that hadn't dimmed even after everything he'd taken from her. He had built his empire on control. And yet, in one night, she had undone him completely. He whispered to the empty room, "You're stronger than any of us, Julia." And as the first light of dawn broke through the clouds, he made a silent vow. If war was coming, then let it come. But this time, he wouldn't fight for his name or his power. He'd fight for her, for their daughter, for the chance to finally become the man they believed he could be. The night was painted in flame. From the ridge above the valley, Julia Monroe could see Vincent Hale's estate burning like the end of the world. The mansion, once a monument to wealth and cruelty, glowed orange against the dark horizon, its reflection shimmering off the storm-soaked pavement. Smoke coiled upward like the ghosts of every sin committed within its walls. In the distance, Caleb Ward's convoy rolled forward, headlights slicing through the mist. His men were shadows, silent and armed, each one moving with the precision of soldiers who knew this would be their final battle. Julia gripped the edge of the passenger seat, her pulse hammering so hard it drowned out the engine. Ethan Cole drove, his knuckles pale around the steering wheel. "You shouldn't be here," he said, voice rough. "I'm done hiding." He glanced at her, eyes sharp beneath the dim dashboard light. "You think that's courage?" "It's suicide." "I think it's love," Julia shot back. "And maybe that's the only thing left worth dying for." Ethan's jaw tightened. "Caleb would kill me for bringing you." "He'll thank you when this is over." But they both knew Caleb wouldn't thank anyone, not for this. Tonight wasn't about gratitude. It was about ending the man who'd haunted their lives for years. As they neared the outer gates, gunfire cracked in the distance. Sharp, metallic, final. The estate's guards were already engaged, muzzle flashes blooming like lightning across the courtyard. Hale's men fought like cornered wolves, but Caleb's crew pressed forward in a disciplined rhythm. Ethan stopped the car behind a stone wall, killing the lights. "This is as far as we go. There's a service entrance behind the west wing. It'll take you straight to the lower hall." Julia reached for the door. He caught her wrist. "You see Caleb, you get him out. You don't play hero." "I stopped being a bystander the moment Hale went after my daughter," she said, her voice steady. "Now drive me closer." Ethan hesitated, then nodded once and hit the gas. The tires splashed through puddles, the air thick with smoke and cordite. As the gates came into view, bent, half melted from the blast that tore them open, Julia's breath hitched. Men shouted. Bodies moved in the shadows. When Ethan braked again, she jumped out before he could stop her, sprinting across the rain-slick gravel toward the side door. The mansion's once white walls were streaked with soot. Glass crunched beneath her shoes. Somewhere inside, something exploded, an echo of fury and gasoline. She ducked under a broken archway and slipped through the side entrance, heart pounding. Inside was chaos. The air reeked of smoke and gunpowder, heat radiating from the flames chewing through the west corridor. Furniture was overturned, portraits shattered. The house that had hosted galas and blackmail dinners now burned like a confession. Julia pressed herself against the wall, listening. Footsteps. Voices. "Ward's men are inside the east wing." Hold them off. He's headed for the main hall. Caleb. Her pulse spiked. She followed the sound, weaving through corridors choked with smoke until the marble foyer opened before her. And there he was. Caleb stood near the grand staircase, gun raised, his shirt darkened with soot and blood. Across from him, Vincent Hale waited with a calm that didn't belong in a battlefield. The rival crime lord was bleeding from a shoulder wound, his immaculate suit torn, but his smile was steady. A predator's smile. "You built your empire on blood, Ward," Hale called over the crackle of fire. "Let's see if she bleeds too." He turned slightly, and Julia froze. He was looking at her. Caleb's head snapped around, eyes widening. "Julia, no!" Hale moved first. The gun in his hand gleamed under the firelight. Time fractured. Julia didn't think, she moved. Her heel caught on debris as she lunged forward, grabbing for the weapon lying beside a fallen guard. Her hands were slick with ash and rain. The gun felt heavy, too heavy, but she lifted it anyway. The world narrowed to the space between Hale's smirk and the trembling crosshair of her aim. He said something. She never heard what. The gunshot swallowed it whole. The recoil jolted through her arms. The sound slammed against her eardrums. Hale staggered, disbelief flashing across his face before he fell backward into the flames consuming his marble throne. Silence followed, deep and unnatural, broken only by the soft hiss of burning fabric and Julia's ragged breathing. The gun slipped from her hand. Caleb crossed the room in 3 strides, catching her as her knees gave out. His arms wrapped around her, grounding her in the storm of it all. "You did what I couldn't," he whispered, voice rough. His forehead pressed to hers, his breath shaking. "You ended it." She tried to speak, but the words caught somewhere between terror and relief. He brushed her hair from her face, his hands steady despite the tremor in his jaw. "Look at me." She did. And what she saw in his eyes wasn't the cold fury of a man who'd built an empire. It was grief, and love, and a kind of awe he didn't know how to name. Sirens began to wail in the distance, faint at first, then growing louder, an army of consequences speeding toward them. "We have to go," he said. But she couldn't move. Her body was locked, her mind still replaying the sound of the gunshot, the image of Hale falling, the smoke curling like black ribbons over his body. "Julia," Caleb murmured, tightening his grip. "Listen to me. You're not a killer. You're a survivor. You did what you had to do." Tears slipped down her cheeks, hot against her soot-streaked skin. "Then why does it feel like I just lost something I can't get back?" "Because you did," he said softly. "So did I." They stumbled toward the side exit, the fire chasing their shadows down the hall. Ethan appeared through the smoke, face streaked with sweat. "We've got a minute before this place goes up." "Go!" Caleb barked, pulling Julia with him. They burst into the courtyard just as the mansion's roof caved in behind them, flames devouring the last of Vincent Hale's empire. The blast threw sparks into the sky, painting the rain in fire. Julia turned back once, watching the inferno collapse on itself. For a moment, she thought she heard laughter, Hale's voice, fading into the crackle of burning wood. Then it was gone. They didn't stop until they reached the car. Julia climbed into the back seat, hands still shaking. Ethan started the engine, tires screeching over the wet gravel as they tore down the hillside. Caleb sat beside her, silent. The glow of the fire faded behind them, replaced by the cold wash of dawn beginning to break over the horizon. Julia leaned her head against the window, the hum of the engine lulling her into exhaustion. Her body ached. Her heart felt hollow. "I killed him," she whispered. Caleb didn't answer right away. Then quietly he said, "You saved us." "That's not the same thing." "No," he agreed. "It isn't." The road wound down through the forest, trees blurring past in the mist. Ethan's voice broke the silence. "We'll take the coastal route. It's clear." Caleb nodded but didn't look away from Julia. "When we get home, you rest. I'll handle the fallout." "Home," she said softly, like the word was foreign. "Wherever you are," he replied. "That's where home is." For the first time, she didn't argue. By the time the sirens reached Hale's estate, it was already too late. Fire consumed everything: records, weapons, secrets. The last remnants of his reign vanished in smoke, leaving only the echo of what had been. And in that destruction, something else was born. Not peace, not forgiveness, but the fragile beginning of freedom. Julia watched the sunrise as they reached the cliffs overlooking the ocean. The light touched the waves in gold, the air thick with salt and smoke. She felt Caleb's hand slip into hers, strong and warm despite everything they'd done. "What happens now?" she asked. He looked out at the sea, his profile carved in morning light. "Now we start over." She turned to him. "And the past?" His jaw tightened. "We bury it." She nodded, though she knew some ghosts never stayed buried. Still, for the first time since the gala, the ache in her chest began to ease. The war was over. Not because they'd won, but because they'd survived. Caleb squeezed her hand. "You're stronger than I ever was." Julia looked at him, at the man she once loved and maybe still did, and said quietly, "Then maybe it's time you let someone else lead." He smiled faintly, a broken, beautiful thing. "Maybe it is." The wind caught her hair, carrying away the last scent of smoke. Somewhere behind them, the ashes of Hale's empire smoldered in silence. Ahead, the ocean waited, vast, uncertain, and full of new beginnings. For the first time in years, Julia didn't feel trapped between fear and fate. She felt free. And as the sun climbed higher, turning the world gold, Caleb Ward finally let go of the man he'd been, and took her hand as the man he wanted to become. The ocean was calm that morning, too calm for a man who'd spent most of his life surrounded by chaos. Caleb Ward stood on the porch of the small coastal house, coffee cooling in his hand, the sea wind brushing against his face. It had been weeks since the fire, since Vincent Hale's empire turned to ash, since Caleb himself had walked away from the ruins of his own kingdom. Headlines had called it the fall of a king. The papers had been less poetic. Ward Syndicate disbands, Kingpin walks away. But for Caleb, it didn't feel like a fall. It felt like a quiet surrender, the kind you make when you realize the world you built was never meant to last. The city had already moved on. Ethan Cole now ran what was left of the Ward holdings, what Caleb had called the bones of the empire. He'd made them clean, legitimate. Shipping, construction, investments. No blood, no guns. Ethan had once told him, "Someone has to make sure the monster stays dead." And Caleb had agreed. He'd had enough of ghosts. Now his days were smaller, simpler. Mornings by the ocean, evenings with silence that didn't feel like punishment. And in the middle of it all, Julia and Ella. Julia Monroe, the woman who had once been a storm in his ordered world, now stood where his future began again. The soft sound of piano music drifted through the open window behind him. Julia's new dance studio, the Harbor School of Ballet, sat in the nearby town square. The funding had come anonymously, through one of Caleb's legitimate companies. She'd known, of course. Julia was too sharp not to. But she'd never said a word. He liked it that way. She deserved the illusion of distance, even if both of them knew it wasn't real. Footsteps padded behind him. "She's been up since sunrise," Julia said, her voice warm, threaded with amusement. Caleb turned. Julia stood in the doorway, sunlight pooling around her like it couldn't help itself. Her hair was loose, her face still soft with sleep. I don't think she ever sleeps, Caleb said with a small smile. Julia's gaze followed his toward the shore. Down below, Ella twirled barefoot on the wet sand, her laughter scattering with the wind. Each movement was imperfect, but full of joy, a freedom Julia had once fought to protect. She still thinks you're just a friend, Julia murmured, stepping beside him. He chuckled quietly. Then maybe I should earn more than that. She looked at him, really looked at him. The hard lines of his face had softened. The shadows in his eyes were still there, but lighter now. Less like a man haunted by violence and more like one learning to live without it. You're trying, she said softly. For her, he replied. Julia tilted her head. And for you? Caleb paused, watching the horizon where sea met sky. For once, I don't know what I'm supposed to be without the fight. Julia's hand brushed his. Maybe you don't need to be anything. Maybe it's enough just to be. The world had changed in subtle ways. The men who once feared his name now treated him like a relic of another era. Old alliances dissolved. Enemies faded into silence. His father's empire, the legacy he'd been born into, molded by, was gone. In its place was something he'd never imagined wanting. Peace. Still, peace came with its own kind of restlessness. Sometimes, late at night, he'd wake to the sound of rain against the roof and reach for the gun that wasn't there anymore. Other nights, he'd sit by the window, listening to Julia's steady breathing, and wonder how long he had before this calm slipped away. Because men like him weren't built for happy endings. They were built for survival. And yet, every morning Ella would come running down the hall, curls bouncing, calling his name, "Mr. Ward, come see!" And the walls inside him would crack a little more. The day stretched warm and slow. Julia left for the studio after breakfast, her dance bag slung over her shoulder. Caleb drove her there sometimes, but today she wanted to walk, the kind of simple independence she'd once fought for when he was the man she feared. He watched her go, then wandered down the beach to where Ella was building a crooked sandcastle fortress, her face smudged with salt and sun. "You need a moat," he said, crouching beside her. She looked up at him, squinting in the sunlight. "What's a moat?" "It's a ditch around the castle," he explained, tracing a line in the sand with a stick. "Keeps the bad guys out." She frowned in concentration. "But what if the bad guys come from the sky?" Caleb smiled faintly. "Then you build higher walls." She studied him for a long moment, her small fingers still digging. "You talk like someone who's fought a lot of bad guys." "Maybe I have." Her eyes narrowed, thoughtful beyond her years. "Did you win?" He hesitated. "Sometimes. But winning doesn't always mean you're right." Ella nodded solemnly, then grinned. "Mom says you're brave." "Does she now?" "She said you helped us when we needed it most." Caleb's throat tightened. He looked toward the horizon, the sunlight catching in the waves. "Your mom's braver than I'll ever be." When Julia returned that evening, the house smelled like salt and cinnamon. Caleb was in the kitchen, sleeves rolled up, trying, and mostly failing, to make dinner. She paused in the doorway, laughter lighting her face. "You do know you're supposed to stir the sauce, right?" He glanced at the stove, then back at her. "I was letting it simmer in reflection." Julia shook her head, stepping closer to rescue the pan. "You run an empire for 10 years, but can't make pasta." "Correction. I used to run an empire," he said with a smirk. "Now I'm just a man trying not to poison his family." Her hands stilled for a heartbeat at that word. Family. When she looked at him again, there was something softer in her expression. Not forgiveness, not yet, but the space where forgiveness might grow. Later, after dinner, the three of them walked along the shore. The sun dipped low, setting the waves on fire with streaks of gold and crimson. Ella ran ahead, chasing seagulls, her laughter a melody that stitched the quiet together. Julia wrapped her arms around herself. "She still doesn't know who you are to her," she said quietly. Caleb nodded. "I don't want to take away the childhood she has left. When she's older, she deserves to know the truth. Not the headlines, not my sins, the truth." Julia studied his face, the way the light caught in his eyes. "And what's that?" "That I loved her before I even knew her." Her breath hitched. "You're not that man anymore, Caleb." "No," he said, "but I remember him, and I don't ever want to be him again." The tide rolled in, cool around their ankles. "For her sake," she whispered. "For hers," he echoed. And in that moment, the past didn't feel like a weight anymore. It felt like a story ending the only way it could, with loss, redemption, and the faint promise of something new. The days blurred gently after that. Julia's school flourished. Caleb began investing in small local businesses under his own name. He met with old enemies, not to threaten, but to make amends. It wasn't forgiveness he sought, but peace. Sometimes, he'd find Julia sitting on the porch at sunset, her eyes following Ella's silhouette as the child danced against the horizon. He'd join her in silence, both of them knowing that words weren't needed anymore. The world had taken so much from them. And yet, here they were, breathing, rebuilding, beginning again. One evening, Ella practiced her spins on the sand, her curls glinting gold under the dying sun. Caleb knelt beside her, steadying her when she stumbled. "Keep your balance," he said gently. "Eyes up." She reached out, her small hand resting on his shoulder for balance. He smiled, the motions simple, perfect. From the porch, Julia watched, her heart full and fragile all at once. For the first time, Caleb Ward wasn't running an empire. He wasn't fighting for control, or power, or vengeance. He was simply learning how to hold on to something worth losing. The waves whispered against the shore, carrying away the last echoes of who they once were. And as the sky bled into twilight, 3 figures stood hand in hand: the fallen king, the woman who saved him, and the little girl who rebuilt them both. Finally walking into the quiet life they almost lost. If this story moved you, don't forget to subscribe. It's how I know these moments reach your heart. Even if you're watching on your TV, take a second to join our community of story lovers. Your support keeps these emotions and stories alive.